Over half a century has passed since the end of World War II. Is it possible that the memory of the many sacrifices made by our greatest generation of men and women in that terrible war could ever fade away and one day be forgotten? At least one grateful son in Michigan sat down one day to prevent this from ever happening. He carefully penned a letter to his father and veteran sailor, Al Krzemecki. Al and his twin brother, Ed, were both survivors of the bloody war in the Pacific. They were ship fitters, working deep in the lower decks of the aircraft carrier USS Gambier Bay in the Philippines. Somehow, the two brothers survived the violent shelling and ultimate sinking of their ship by the Japanese during the crucial Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. The following is son Tom's heartfelt and detailed letter to his father Al, written years later, so that we should never forget the many tragic and momentous events of World War II. Events that would ultimately shape the America that we all know and love today.
October 25th, 1998. Dad, I wanted to write to acknowledge that a very important day is here again. That day is the anniversary date of the sinking of the USS Gambier Bay, the only aircraft carrier ever to be sunk solely by enemy shell fire. History was made that day when a small group of escort carriers and a handful of destroyers, known as Taffy 3, fought it out with the largest Japanese naval force of World War II, which included the Yamato, the largest battleship ever created. Shortly after sunrise on October 25, 1944, the masts of the Japanese battleships and cruisers could be seen on the horizon, knowing full well that they were outgunned and didn't stand a chance at victory. The group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts headed north to courageously engage the enemy. Shortly after 7 a.m., the Japanese fleet began shelling the escort carriers from a range of 20 miles. The single 5-inch guns in the carriers were no match for the 16-inch shells coming at them. Many of these colored shells were near misses, but those misses did hit the little escort carriers, had a devastating effect. Massive amounts of water poured into the ship as holes were opened up large enough to drive a car through. Countless men were trapped below decks that were sometimes intentionally sealed off to protect the ship from sinking. Fire and smoke was everywhere, with wounded and dying men crying for help. Bombs were exploding in almost every compartment, and damage control parties, of which you were part of, frantically rushed to seal up and warped and twisted bulkheads against the rush of incoming water. During this time, the destroyers were gallantly trying to protect the carriers by charging headlong into the Japanese force and forcing them to break formation in an effort to cause confusion and havoc. Even after running out of ammunition and torpedoes, the USS Hull, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, and the USS Johnston continued to engage the enemy with dummy torpedo runs in an effort to protect the carriers until they were eventually sunk by the opposing Japanese force. Included in this group of carriers was the USS Gambier Bay, a Casablanca-class carrier commissioned on July 15, 1943 as CVE-73. Early in the battle, about 7 a.m., a shell from the Yamato hit one of the engine rooms of the Gambier Bay, which resulted in it losing speed and falling behind the rest of the group, making it increasingly vulnerable to attack. As it slowed and eventually lay dead in the water, the Japanese ships converged on it and continuously shelled it at point-blank range. It was at this time that Captain Walter Vuig, the commanding officer at the time, ordered the crew to abandon ship. It was then, Dad, that you and Uncle Eddy took a heavy rope and tied yourselves together so that you wouldn't get separated in the ocean and jumped overboard. After more relentless shelling by the Japanese ships, the USS Gambier Bay rolled over and sank at 7 minutes after 9 o'clock a.m. on October 25, 1944. All that remained were the majority of her 800 crew members now floating in the water. I remember you saying that when the Gambier Bay rolled over, It looked like a spaghetti strainer because of all the holes in it from the enemy shells. As the battle progressed, the survivors in the water became scattered across many, many square miles of ocean. It soon became evident that they would be there for some time and that rescue could be days away. Some of the sailors were lucky enough to have a piece of floating debris to cling to assist them in staying afloat. However, most of the sailors only had their K-Pock life vests to keep them from drowning. The next 3 days were a nightmare for the sailors. Their life vests were becoming water-soaked and losing their buoyancy. With no water to drink, nothing to eat, the sailors were starting to become delirious and began to see and hear things that weren't there. Many left the safety of the group only to swim off and get eaten by sharks. Many of the sailors were also suffering from severe burns, which were aggravated by the salt water and the relentless rays of the afternoon sun. Severe sunburn was affecting everyone as ears, lips, and faces swelled under the intense heat of the sun. Time was spent talking, and most importantly, praying that they would be rescued soon. After 3 days in the water, the survivors were rescued from the sea by landing in patrol craft that had been dispatched from the island of Leyte. Among the survivors were Captain Vueg and 2 twin boys, now men, known as Al and Ed Krzemecki. Captain Vueg continued his career in the Navy and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1954. The twins, as they were known, returned to their home in Memphis, Michigan on 30-day survivor's leave, where they were later reassigned together to the USS Intrepid. During their tour of duty on the Intrepid, the twins were given a piece of good news when the pilots on the Intrepid informed them that they had sunk the Yamato. It was payback time. Dad, it is now 58 years later. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is just an event in time to those who read and follow naval history. But to the sailors who were there on the decks of the Gambier Bay, the St. Lo, the Hull, the Johnston, and the Samuel B. Roberts, it is a nightmare that they've had to deal with for so many years. Anyone who has experienced the horrors of war has dealt with it in their own way. Some people refuse to talk about it. Some speak about it with tears. Others with anger. The important thing is that their sacrifices will never be forgotten. So, Dad, on this day, let me say that I am very proud of you. I also want to thank you for the great sacrifices you made during World War II to protect our country and keep it safe. It is my pledge to you that my children and their children will always know what happened on that 25th day of October in 1944. From your son, Tom Krzemecki.